Well, thanks for everyone for being here and for having read our paper. Before I start, I just have to give credit to the Facebook page of Unreasonable Anti-Rolshan Memes for the cover of this very short presentation. It's actually a meme that very well represents the account of political liberalism that we are defending, although we are also changing some components of it in this paper. So Gabriele and I thought about how to actually present the paper. Initially, we wanted to give a proper presentation, but if you read the paper, you have noticed that the paper is quite technical, so it was actually quite impossible for us to give a proper presentation of the paper. So we are not trying to do that now. What we will do is to give you some context, some background context for the paper. So initially, we thought about this paper as a freestanding article, a journal article, but then we are now thinking of it actually as the first chapter of our book project, which is now under contract. So Maria Paola, if you can just click to the next slide. So the book project is about political liberalism and what political liberalism can say about the containment of those who are enemies of liberal democracy. So the driving force of this project is what is part 2 of the book. So how political liberals can put forward an account of containment, which sounds plausible, but at the same time doesn't violate the main tenets of political liberalism. And in the book project, we will focus on the case of the populist radical right. So we already published some pieces out of the second part of the book project. And basically, the second part of the book project really zoomed in on different actors, non-state actors, and what they should do. But in order to provide a fully fledged account of containment, what also we needed to do is to, in a sense, go back to more foundational questions about political liberalism, more philosophical questions about what political liberalism is for, and some of the key notions in political liberalism, including the famous or infamous notion of unreasonableness. So now in next slide, for the next slide, Gabriele will zoom in on chapter 1, which is precisely on what is the task, what is the question of political liberalism, and we'll give you just I guess a snapshot of the argument that we make in the paper that you read. So Maria Paola, it's just the next slide.
Yes, thank you. So it's you know, as Alasia said, we thought it would be impossible to summarize the argument for you. So we'll just give you a little background. So basically, the goals that we mean to achieve in the chapter. So the frame of the chapter, of course, is provided by Jonathan Kwong's so-called internal view of what political liberal theory is all about, what falls within outside the scope of political liberal theory. Of course, Kwong systematizes that pretty well, but those ideas had been in the air for a long while with the work of people like Paul Waitman or Leyden and others. So the internal view is very appealing to many because it's pretty modest, and as such, it's able to reply to a lot of traditional criticisms of political liberalism. So the internal character of the internal view is essentially twofold. So on the one hand, it just gives up the impossible dream of public reasoning being basically a justification of liberalism to every last person in society. So justification of liberalism to the unconvinced. And the second internal element is an appreciation that this big problem of reasonable pluralism that political liberals grapple with, that's not a sort of a fact of the world, like resource scarcity that liberalism, but also other ideologies have to grapple with, and allegedly liberalism deals with better than the other ideologies. Reasonable pluralism is a product of liberal conditions, essentially individual liberties, and as such, political liberal theory becomes just a matter of internal coherence. So what we want to argue for is that Kwong is wrong in packaging all these, which we very much agree with, together with the idea that somehow proper political liberal theory is only ideal theory, so theory about the well-ordered society. We want to expand the scope of political liberal theory so as to include non-ideal, pretty imperfect and minimally liberal societies, like potentially several real-world liberal democracies. And we basically want to vindicate that all of that sort of analysis without giving up all the benefits that come with the modesty of the internal view. Of course, in so doing, we'll be also vindicating the books project. So the project of, for example, looking at right-wing populism as a case study for the containment of unreasonable views in society. And in the process of doing this, we will also be making a point about what the correct relationship between ideal and non-ideal theory is, specifically when it comes to Rawlsian political liberalism, which becomes something pretty different from the more standard understanding of the relationship between ideal and non-ideal theory in Rawlsian theories of justice. So two important enterprises, but to be pursued largely independently. So this was very much all we wanted to cover in this presentation. We are looking forward to any questions you might have about the chapter, about, well, anything broader than the chapter.
Yeah, also
anything you would like to ask.
Yeah, any questions also about the book project? I mean, we realized that this was a bit a technical paper, so if you also have questions about the big project, we're really happy to answer to them.
There's something in the chat. Sorry, question.
So I think we are done with our presentation.
Great. Well, thanks for that. So I'll take, if you want to ask a question, just write hand in the chat. If you have a finger on the question, then just write finger. So at your will, please. Great. So let's kick off with Bettina.
Yeah, apologies. I've not had time to read the paper. Like everyone else, I'm kind of busy teaching, although not at universities, but can be just as busy. So it may all be in the paper. But my first question really is, can you tell us more about the features of what you call a minimally liberal society?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely. So it's also a question that we have tried to think hard about. So what we mean by minimal liberal societies are societies that may be unjust, but that they at least have a commitment to respect certain kind of freedom, especially those kind of freedoms that then enable the creation of reasonable pluralism. So freedom of thought, freedom of conscience, and then political freedom. It's enough for us that there is a commitment to respect this freedom, because in many society that we will call a minimal liberal, then these sort of freedoms are not necessarily guaranteed. But the fact that there is a commitment, it could be, for example, written in the Constitution, to these sort of freedoms, according to us, doesn't make at all these societies just and, of course, in the spirit of political liberalism, legitimate, fully legitimate, but it still enables the creation and the spread of reasonable pluralism. So according to us, this is where the question of political liberalism starts arising.
Thank you.
No worries.
Great. Andre?
Yes, thanks so much for the paper. I have two questions. So one is actually in relation to what you call minimally liberal societies. I was wondering how, so you clarified it a bit right now, but I was wondering how you deal with matters of threshold when it comes to those freedoms that you list, so freedom of conscience, political association, vote, and more generally the freedom to engage in rational activity. Because I mean, especially spontaneously when you mentioned, parts of Europe and parts of North America fitting into this category, I was, well, isn't that hopeful or optimistic? I mean, I would certainly not put the United States in that category.
Right, yeah.
So there will be a wide range of
tell us more. So tell us maybe a little bit more about where you see the difference there between maybe more plausible European countries and the less plausible example of the US.
So if you, I don't know, if you are Tommy Shelby, for example, you think that they are not, minimally liberal either, that the United States is a minimally liberal country because the range of minimal liberalism goes all the way to the fair equality of opportunity principle. So that would be a question, and it seems a bit ad hoc that you would kind of stop at that kind of short list of political liberties and freedoms. So that's one question. But even if, barring discussions about the United States, how do you deal with problems of thresholds when it comes to satisfying those freedoms, either individually or jointly, or variations thereof? That's the first one. And the second one, maybe it's a suggestion, but it's also partly a clarificatory question. So on your kind of what I would call the non-derivative, non-ideal theory account, so not derivative ideal theory. I was wondering whether, when you talk about the rhetorical strategies for engaging with unreasonable views, one advantage might also be that actually it's not so much that we devise those rhetorical strategies, but that in devising them, we might come up with extra arguments or useful revisions of political liberalism itself. So something structurally similar to what Mill, for example, is saying about free speech, right? So it prevents true opinion from becoming dogma. So similarly, we might say that in engaging with unreasonable views, it prevents political liberalism from becoming dogma. Just like when we have to teach roles to students who have no background in political philosophy, we might find out extra things about roles and others.
Yeah.
Good. Thank you. Yes, the first question is a very important one. So it's very similar to a question that one of the book referees also asked us, and in fact, we realized in writing our reply that we need to sort of rewrite to some extent that bit, because the very label minimally liberal societies is very easily misread as societies that, from a liberal perspective, that are good enough. That's absolutely not what we mean to say. So those are illegitimate society, as you say, maybe not because they don't guarantee fair equality of opportunity, but surely they don't guarantee maybe any equality of opportunity, even less demanding than fair equality of opportunity. So they're surely not even reasonably just. So the choice of only focusing on at least a general provision of freedoms of speech and association and thought is basically, it connects back to the only function that notion of minimal liberal society is meant to play, which is to identify the sufficient conditions for reasonable pluralism to emerge. So those societies are very, very far from okay, not just perfectly just, they're far from okay. They need a lot of work, but you can expect reasonable pluralism in it, because not even perfectly, but there has been enough, especially through time, in the way of protection of freedom of speech, association, political liberties. That's it. But we realize it's not. I think that those couple of paragraphs are not drafted perfectly yet. We are of course reworking the chapter, during this time, and we'll take care of that. Do you wanna do the non-ideal, non-derivative?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting thought, Andrei. I mean, it may be that by using those rhetorical strategies, which are meant to, in a sense, change a bit the mind of unreasonable citizens, you actually find out something new about political liberalism, which may also help you, in a sense, explain it better or make it less a dogma, as you were saying. I think that this is a bit part of what we think a kind of conversation, a dialogue between reasonable citizens, for example, and unreasonable citizens might look like. So in other work that we did, and which will then be chapter 4 of our book project, we precisely try to construct this sort of dialogue. And in order to be, in a sense, a proper, respectful dialogue, there's also the fact that the reasonable citizen must be open to the dialogue, and also be open to listen to and take seriously some of the concerns of unreasonable citizens. And that might be that, maybe it's not gonna, the hope is that not that they will become unreasonable themselves, but maybe they are gonna, for example, start thinking that consideration of socioeconomic justice are more important than they thought, right? So there is this sort of exchange, and I think that that's part of rhetoric, right? That's part of what at least an understanding of rhetoric as respectful should look like.
Great. Should we go with Maria Paula?
Yeah, so I want to go exactly in this direction. So to ask, so this attraction that the reasonable exercise on the non-reasonable, I wanted you to go a bit into it, because you present it in this dialogical form, but at the same time, the hope there seems to be that by engaging, you come out perhaps with a better interpretation of reasonable principle, but still you expect this reasonable principle or criteria or reasonableness to attract a non-reasonable to the right side. So, and in a way, this is the attraction of your approach, because you say, okay, we have this moral and political ideal that is based on reasonableness, and with dialogue or communicative strategy has this potential of bringing also the unreasonable on your side in a way. So I wanted to know a bit more about it. So how you imagine. So I find it is great, it's super attractive, but yeah, how it should work.
We haven't tested empirically, even if sometimes, we try to, in a sense, do what, practice what we argue for, right, on Facebook or other fora with some friends or acquaintances, right, who, we will label unreasonable according to Rawls terms. So I think what we do in part 2 is identify different kind of actors. So we we focus on citizens, and that's where rhetoric for us becomes an important tool that reasonable citizens have in their pocket to engage with unreasonable people that they know. But then we also focus on reasonable political parties and then municipalities, right? So it's not that the whole burden is on the shoulders of reasonable citizens. But what we think is that rhetoric, and we identify specific kind of rhetorical strategies, can be very powerful, especially when it's practiced by reasonable citizens vis-a-vis unreasonable citizens that they know. Because rhetoric has the power, it's very powerful when you know the audience. So when you know even some personal life experiences of that audience, and you can draw on them in order to persuade them. So we, in a sense, we do think that rational argument is not all that matters when it comes to politics. That politics is made also of emotions, affect, and so on. And that in some respect, political liberals are not there's nothing inconsistent with political liberalism, but very often political liberalism and rules is represented as just advocating for a very rational form of dialogue. So it's by using some strategies like reasoning from analogies or really looking at the experience of the unreasonable citizens that you know, that you can actually build the right arguments that push the right buttons and then can hopefully at least make these people reflect a bit more on their political commitments, and maybe the consistency of their political commitments with some other aspects of their life, being them their comprehensive doctrines or other personal facts.
Right. Let's go with, I think, Kai or Kay.
Yeah, that's Kay. I have two questions, if I may. So one is about the enemies of liberalism. Mm-hmm. I got the impression that you are mainly thinking about internal enemies, meaning those illiberal people in a liberal society. But I was wondering if you had something to say about external enemy, which in a way is more challenging. And I'm not thinking about something like the Islamic State, because that wouldn't be terribly interesting. I'm thinking about something like Singapore. So let's say it's not a liberal society as we ordinarily understand it, but it is quite an attractive society. It's well organized. It seems to be able to deal with crises fairly well, perhaps better than liberal societies. And I think people in liberal society tend to feel a little attractive. It's a rather seductive regime, and therefore it poses a challenge to the legitimacy of liberal societies, especially a liberal society is only minimally liberal. So I was wondering if you have anything to say about those kind of external enemies. It doesn't have to be about this type of external enemy, but or whether you intended to simply focus or just to focus on the internal ones in your book. The second question is probably just my confusion, but I just wanted you to clarify the relationship between reasonable pluralism and liberalism. On page 10, you say reasonable pluralism is a product of liberal conditions, and similar statements are found throughout the paper, and I think it is a very important idea. But I thought it was the other way around. I thought reasonable pluralism was the condition for thinking about political liberalism. Because if you say reasonable pluralism is a product of liberal conditions, what is being implied is that there was no reasonable pluralism before the 19th century, or there is no reasonable pluralism anywhere outside of liberal societies. And that seems to me to be a big questionable claim. So I was just wondering, probably you mean something very specific by reasonable pluralism, in which case I would understand, but I just wanted you to clarify.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Do you want to take that?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, so especially the title of the book as it stands is a bit ambiguous about what are we planning to contain here. So it really is, as you said, the domestic spread of illiberal anti-democratic views, and of course working from within Russian political liberalism as canonically understood. It's difficult to extend the analysis so as also to include international enemies. So we would have to join the second rules, political liberalism, with the third one, so the laws of the people. But I guess we are the sort of Russians that would rather like to forget about that book, which however I think would link back quite interestingly to some of the things you said about Singapore, right? So the idea of decent societies. So they're not liberal, but they have some things to recommend them. I think in a sense that book would resonate to I think some of your thoughts about Singapore. I would say reasonable pluralism and liberalism. Do you want to?
No, we can go.
That's a difficult one. Again, here liberalism is to be understood in a hugely minimal sense of the term. In a sense, going back to the reply I gave to Andre, it's nothing close to being enough for liberal legitimacy. Even it's those core commitments to people can sort of reflect freely about religion and the good life, can sort of voice their opinions freely, can associate freely into communities of like-minded co-religionaries or people, other like-minded people. So in that minimal sense of the term, reasonable pluralism is only possible under liberal conditions. So there must either be a sort of an explicit commitment to guaranteeing those liberties, or an authoritarian state is not functioning well enough to guarantee suppression, oppression of disagreement. So there is either a hugely minimal set of liberal institutions working, or there is an authoritarian state that doesn't quite work well any longer. Let's say, for example, a sort of a theocratic state that, however, doesn't have the strength any longer to sort of suppress heresy. So basically, the only well-functioning set of institutions that can guarantee reasonable pluralism is the core of a liberal state, the most minimal core. So that's confusedly the idea that I would like to convey.
So when Greek philosophers disagree with each other, assuming that they are reasonable, does that mean the Greek city-state was liberal in your sense of the term? Or are they being unreasonable, assuming that they are disagreeing with each other?
It's difficult, isn't it? Right. So to translate a concept like reasonableness that has been around for in its Russian iteration for maybe 30 years to Athens. Well, they would I imagine they would definitely count as unreasonable because this agreement was just suppressed.
Mm-hmm.
Wasn't it? So quite with quite physical consequences, at least in some areas. It's a nice exercise though, isn't it? To ask yourself, were the Athenians reasonable? But I would say no, they were not.
We had a finger from Andre.
Yeah, thanks. I was going to continue what Kay asked you, but maybe from another angle. My question is, why do you insist on calling your conception or your project an internal conception or an internal project? Aren't you already going external when you are trying to address those unreasonable citizens? Although they live within a minimally liberal society, but they're already reasonable. So what are you afraid of, or if you are afraid of anything? Why are you still insisting on calling it an internal conception instead of just going, well, we are gaining new grounds for political liberalism?
Yeah, no, thanks. It's a very good question. So I think we are still internalists in two ways. So first is really how we think that what is the logic of political liberalism. So in a sense, we don't think that pluralism is something that reasonable pluralism is just something that is a fact of the world, and then liberalism needs to like reply right to it, and it can reply to it in a more convincing way. Political liberalism can reply to pluralism as a fact of the world in a more convincing way than other approaches to pluralism. So we like Jonathan Kwong, we think about it in terms of internal coherence, so as something that is actually enabled by liberal conditions. So this is the reason why it's interesting. But more about your point on unreasonableness. So the way in which some external views, which were actually mainly critiques of Rawls, who maybe misunderstood what Rawls was saying, thought about political liberalism was about really justifying to everyone the appeal of living in a political liberal society. Here we are doing something different. So containment is not about a justification. So you don't owe unreasonable citizen anything in terms of justification. You are address unreasonable citizens, unreasonable views when they are becoming a threat to the stability of society. So let's imagine that you have a society where you just have a very small number of unreasonable citizens. But you don't, from a political liberal perspective, from an internal political perspective like ours, that's fine. You know, you can just leave them in a sense alone. They will have the rights of everyone else, but it's not that you need to give them a justification. So the society is still legitimate from our point of view, even if in a sense you're not justifying it to unreasonable citizens, or even if unreasonable citizens don't accept the sort of justification for the legitimacy of the institution of the society. The task of containment is different. The task of containment kicks in when the number of unreasonable citizens, the spread of unreasonable views is becoming a threat to the stability of a society, right? So, and that's what we are focusing on. But it's not about a justification. We think that the society, you know, itself can still remain as legitimate as it is. We are concerned about the stability. And so we think that then some reasonable actors needs to step in, be that, you know, through rhetorical strategies in the case of reasonable citizens, or other means that we explore in the next chapters. But it's not a problem of justification. The external perspective, we will say that there's something problematic if you don't provide a justification for a political liberal institution to everyone in society. This is not what we think. So we are just concerned about the stability. So that's why we are still internalist.
Great.
Do you
Ben?
wanna? Oh, sorry. We're just wondering if Andrea.
Unless Andrea, if you wanted to come back, we have a bit of time.
The only puzzle that I'm left with, probably I should read the book when you finish it. It is that how can a political liberal do anything politically liberal? For example, such thing as containment, that does not include any trace of justification. I guess the way for a political liberal to contain unreasonable views is to somehow make political liberals attractive. All the other ways are just oppression or ideological, like, I don't know, propaganda, brainwashing, so on.
I mean, that would set the bar terribly high, though. I mean, of course, I mean, what we are recommending is a lot of talk, but the talk, of course, persuades people in a number of ways, and rational arguments is normally not what does most of the heavy lifting. So that's quite classical. You know, if you read, you know, Paul Waitman, if you're brave enough to read that, you know, book about, you know, how people grow reasonable in the world order society, it's not really about just because somebody made an argument that to them and they were convinced. The idea is liberalism grows on you because the institutions sort of shape you in their own image. It's never really a rational process. So the hope is that, you know, we can lay on the table, you know, enough mechanisms through which the unreasonable can be persuaded one way or the other without violating any obvious liberal commitments, without having to prove to them that liberalism is the way to go. Plus, of course, the external view, at least if defined like Wong does it, really involves that the whole political liberal enterprise fails unless you're able to prove to anybody, it doesn't matter how extremely liberal they are at present, that they should embrace liberalism. So that's a very foundational enterprise, an incredibly high bar, and frankly, you know, probably impossible. And the idea is, you know, come on, political liberalism must not stand or fall on the success of that task. I guess that's really the appeal of the internal view, and we buy into that.
Great. Should we go to Ben?
Hi there. Thank you very much for the paper. So I just had a question about the relationship between reasonableness and unreasonableness. So I wondered whether and what, if it is the case, your account might tell us about the limits of reasonable liberal rhetoric in the face of the unreasonable, particularly given, say, the nature of deliberation in unreasonable societies. And so to extrapolate on that a little bit, we might say, for instance, that in a lot of cases, people arrive at unreasonable views, in part because their views, as they're constructed, are sort of unresponsive to various facts around them. So if we think about conspiracy theories like QAnon, things like that, you know, people create these sort of barriers to prevent themselves effectively from either encountering other points of view or being sufficiently challenged by other points of view. And so I wondered whether your paper had any, you know, had any insights into the limits of rhetoric in relation to that. I guess a secondary question that I had, which followed from some of the things that have been said before, you mentioned containment in particular, and so just again to pick up on that theme of the unresponsive, unreasonable person. it sort of seems that in that case, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to contain that person. And if a particular, and if a sufficient portion of the population becomes unreasonable in this way, then very quickly there's a question of, does containment turn into oppression, which is, or something in that regard, which is sort of very unliberal at its very core. So I guess those are the two questions that I had. But thank you for the paper once again.
Yeah, shall I?
Yes.
So thanks, Ben, for your questions. So so in terms of the limits of reasonable rhetoric, I mean, this is a very important question. I mean, I think that in the chapter of the book where we focus on rhetorical strategies, we are not we are not trying to overstate their effectiveness. Neither are we trying to suggest that once you use it's enough that enough reasonable citizens engage with rhetorical strategies to then persuade the unreasonable people that they know, right? And then you are done. We really think about containment as the concerted effort of different actors, and all these actors have their own power. And we hope that this, it's the concerted effort that actually will do the trick, right? Not just the work of reasonable citizens, or even just an encounter with a reasonable citizens that you know. I think that the way in which we think about rhetoric is really tapping in to the sort of personal knowledge that you have of the unreasonable citizen in question, right? So you may, with a really rational argument, for example, through showing the unreasonable citizen, data on migration or like empirical facts, so you might not be able really to do anything in terms of changing their mind, right? So that's also how conspiracy theories are so successful, because in a sense it's very hard to refuse them, right? If you are in that sort of a frame of mind, because any sort of attempt to refuse them can be part of the conspiracy itself. But we are thinking more about really some personal knowledge that you have, showing some inconsistencies between some other commitment that those unreasonable citizens may have. So, for example, some of the religious belief, and then what they, how they act politically. So, one example that we gave in that chapter and in the published paper is the case of a Catholic unreasonable citizen, voting for Matteo Salvini, La Lega, right? So a right-wing populist party, but being Catholic, right? And we think, well, maybe what potentially a reasonable citizen can do is showing the sort of inconsistency between, on the one hand, the sort of more universalistic message of Christianism in general, or what the Pope said about migrants, the sort of more welcoming messages, and then how they act politically. But again, it's it's part of a concerted effort, so we don't think that it's so easy. In a sense, it's difficult. In terms of yes, containment. I mean, I think it's important to say that we don't deny that there may be circumstances in which actually what political liberals should embrace is more militant forms of democratic self-defense. So we are not denying that. We take actually the work of others who have argued that that there may be a time where really things are going so wrong that you need just to restrict the freedoms, right, of some people. So we don't deny that, but we think that in order to make that sort of reaction legitimate from a political liberal perspective, something else must have been tried first. And that's what we are, and this is this something else is what we explore in the book. So it's necessary to first try these softer measures of intervention in order then to even give some legitimacy to more militant forms of democratic self-defense, if we really come to that.
Right. So we have two questions to go, and I'm going to go with Praveen first, Bettina, because you've got your second question. And Praveen, I think, is having trouble with the audio, so I'm going to read out. Hello, sorry, I can't turn on my audio and video due to background noise, but I have a question. Hope you can respond. It is concerning the minimal liberal society as to what if the democratic government and sections of the society prevent reasonableness, then would you see this society as a minimal liberal society? However, the case is of a democratic government and its society, which accordingly does allow some forms of freedom, but there are tools used by government and the society that subverts reasonableness from certain sections of society, e.g. propagandas involved in certain charges of sedition.
Mm-hmm.
Are you across that?
This is very interesting. I guess in a sense this goes back to part of Andrei Puama's question, the part that in fact I dodged using all my sort of my expertise. So the part about drawing a threshold. I don't know, right? So again, I repeat, the real important. The real work that notion minimal liberal societies is supposed to, the only role it's supposed to play is describe those conditions where you can expect a lot of disagreement to arise because people are free to sort of write and exchange opinions and think about stuff. Again, I imagine you can expect that sort of reasonable pluralism, even if selectively the government is effectively oppressing some groups, but not others. And again, Andrei's earlier example about the US is again a good one, because you could think about the African Americans being, of course, traditionally, particularly at the receiving end of sort of suppression of ideas. So again, I imagine that all concepts will have some problems, at drawing, a line in the sand sometimes to say, there is reasonable pluralism, these sides of the line, but not the other side of the line. I would say in reply to that question, that's a difficult one. I imagine that, it's not inconsistent with reasonable pluralism anyway popping up, and therefore somehow the question of political liberalism arising. Just to remember that just the question of political liberalism being somehow on doesn't mean that society is in any way satisfactory from a liberal perspective. It is assumed that if you are in a minimal liberal society, there is a lot of improvement in all before that society is even legitimate. So I would say it's not impossible that there is reasonable pluralism in that society.
Great, and I think we might be able to squeeze in the Turner.
Yeah, can I just first make a quick comment? It seems to me that where you have a conflict between some parts of the state and others, or state institutions and the behavior of a particular government, that's comparatively not easy, but easier to deal with, because you can then point out the inconsistencies. You can sort of play on that as a strategy. Mm-hmm. My original question was actually, you may just want to refer me to the paper, but was actually whether you could give an example of a containment strategy which you think might be successful. So you said containment isn't about justification. So can you give an example of what might work or possibly even has worked?
Yeah, it's, I mean, do you have a clear example? No, I mean,
it's, containment is to be understood very, very, very broadly. So, for example, we have a chapter on partisan action. So that sort of creative, imaginative work that partisans or political parties are at least supposed to be doing, that would count as containment, right? So present day parties will tend to converge towards the center. So the platforms they tend to sell to the electorate tend to be, not very dissimilar from each other. That's a failure potentially today of a responsibility of containment broadly understood. They need to be more imaginative. They need to understand that reasonableness is losing grounds, and each of them should pick a constituency of people that are nowadays attracted, for example, to the populist radical rights. They got to try to work out how to win that back. And that would be, for example, a possible example. So we have this political studies piece that just came out. Basically, just makes this argument, and chapter 5 of the book will just be based on that chapter. So that will still count. So of course, it's a containment, very broadly understood. It's definitely not just lock them up in jail.
So, this is not something that we explore in the book, because the book is very much focused on the case of right-wing populism. So that's the sort of case that we try to analyze in the book. But we explore that other case in another paper that we published. So the case of people who are at risk of radicalization. So, for example, some Muslim young people who are very much and for very good reason disenfranchised, alienated from the institutions that they live in, and they may be tempted, right, by some problematic ideology. And in that paper, we look at strategies of de-radicalization, for example, in northern countries, that have, in a sense, also even bypassed religious arguments. So they focused on creating networks, creating opportunities for socialization, bringing these young people together, doing things together, which actually range from playing a football, playing football together, to have meals together. And in that way, right, just bringing them back.
Yeah.
And this sort of strategy seems to have worked actually pretty well. So it's not, of course, something that we cover in the book, but there are some examples of de-radicalization that are actually about doing things rather than rational arguments about what the sacred texts are saying, even if sometimes they may include that, right? But not only about that too. Creating role models, for example, this sort of stuff.
I think I would probably, what you're describing, I would probably call reintegration rather than containment.
It depends on what's the scope, right? What's the goal?
Yeah.
So there can be also strategies of containment. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't do that for also other reasons, right? Also in response of, when a state is failing, in the case that you were saying to integrate and seriously failing, then there are other actors, non-state actors that are stepping in important ways, and it seems to work.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Great. Well, I think that finishes us on the dot. So thank you so much, Alasia and Gabriele. And then I think that's us for 2020-2021.
Yeah.
Well done. First year of the INTERPR Standing Group on Political Theory Seminar Series.